The telegram arrived at 4:47 in the morning, carried by hands that trembled not from cold but from the weight of what they held. Outside the concrete bunker known as the Wolf's Lair, the East Prussian forest stood frozen under a December sky so dark it seemed to swallow light itself. Inside, Adolf Hitler had not slept in 46 hours. His eyes were red. His hands shook from the cocktail of stimulants his personal physician injected daily. Maps of the Eastern Front surrounded him like accusers, each one telling the same terrible story. Moscow had not fallen. The Wehrmacht had stalled. German soldiers were dying not from Russian bullets but from Russian winter. Then Japan changed everything. The message confirmed what radio intercepts had suggested hours earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating force. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 2,000 Americans dead. The sleeping giant had been stabbed in its sleep. Hitler summoned his inner circle to the map room. Hermann Göring arrived first, his massive frame filling the doorway, his face flushed with excitement. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop followed, clutching decoded cables from the Japanese embassy. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood at attention near the fireplace, waiting for orders that would reshape the world. They expected celebration. The tripartite pact bound Germany to Japan, yes, but it did not require Germany to declare war if Japan attacked first. Hitler had a choice. He could let America focus its rage on Tokyo while Germany finished its business in Russia. The rational move was to stay silent, to let the Pacific burn while Europe froze, but rationality had abandoned this room long ago. Hitler walked to the great map of the Atlantic Ocean mounted on the eastern wall. His finger traced the sea lanes between New York and Liverpool where German U-boats hunted Allied convoys. For months, his submarines had operated under strict orders to avoid American vessels, even when those vessels carried weapons to England. Roosevelt had pushed and provoked, but Hitler had swallowed each insult. He needed time. Time to defeat Russia. Time to consolidate Europe. Time to build the fortress that would last 1,000 years. Now Japan had stolen that time. The room waited. Göring shifted his weight from foot to foot. Ribbentrop cleared his throat but said nothing. The fire crackled. Outside, a guard coughed in the frozen darkness. Hitler spoke without turning from the map. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, as if discussing weather rather than the fate of nations. The war is lost. No one moved. The words hung in the heated air like gas waiting for a spark. Keitel's face went pale. Ribbentrop looked as if he might faint. Even Göring, who feared nothing that flew, seemed to shrink. Hitler let the silence stretch. He watched their reflections in the polished glass covering the map. He saw their fear. He fed on it, then he laughed. The sound was wrong somehow, hollow and sharp at the same time, like a blade scraping bone. He turned to face them, and his eyes had changed. The exhaustion remained, but something else had joined it. Something that burned. Unless we win it in the next 12 months. He strode to the table where the Eastern Front maps waited. His finger stabbed at Moscow, still unconquered, still defiant. The winter offensive had cost Germany over 100,000 casualties in November alone. Frostbite claimed more men than Soviet rifles. Tanks froze solid. Weapons jammed. Supply lines stretched across 1,000 kilometers of hostile territory, but Hitler saw none of this. He saw only the prize. Russia must fall by summer, he declared. Once Moscow is ours, we will have the oil of the Caucasus, the grain of Ukraine, the slaves of the East. Then let America come. Let them try to cross an ocean we control. Let them break themselves against the walls of Fortress Europe. Göring nodded eagerly, his courage returning with his Führer's fire. Ribbentrop was already drafting the declaration of war in his mind, imagining the speech he would deliver to the world. Keitel reached for his notebook, ready to translate madness into military orders. None of them mentioned the numbers. None of them spoke of American steel production, which exceeded Germany's by 400%. None of them calculated how many ships American factories could build, how many planes, how many tanks. None of them remembered 1917, when fresh American troops had broken the Kaiser's armies in months. Hitler dismissed them with a wave. He had a speech to write, a war to declare, a world to burn. Alone in the map room, he stared at the Atlantic Ocean one final time. Somewhere in that blue expanse, the future was already taking shape. American factories were converting. American soldiers were enlisting. American rage was building. The clock had started counting down. Hitler could not hear it yet, but he would. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris walked through the corridors of the Reich Chancellery with the stride of a man approaching his own execution. Around him, junior officers rushed past carrying documents and orders, their boots echoing against marble floors that had witnessed the birth of empires and would soon witness their death. Canaris alone moved slowly. He had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of survival in the Third Reich. The summons had arrived at dawn. Hitler wanted his intelligence chief present for the Reichstag address. The Führer would announce Germany's declaration of war against the United States, and he wanted his generals arrayed behind him like props in a theater production. Canaris understood theater. He had spent his entire career playing roles that kept him alive, but some performances demanded too high a price. That in his pocket, folded into a square no larger than a cigarette case, rested a document that could get him shot. He had memorized its contents years ago, yet he carried it anyway, a talisman of truth in a kingdom of lies. The document bore the dry title, Industrial Capacity Assessment, United States of America, 1940. Its numbers told a story that no speech could change. American automobile production in 1940 exceeded 3 million vehicles. Germany had produced barely 300,000. Each American car represented assembly lines that could build tanks, factories that could forge cannons, workers who could manufacture weapons of war. The mathematics of industry did not care about willpower or racial destiny. Steel was steel. Oil was oil. And America had more of both than Germany could dream of possessing. Canaris had fought in the last war. He remembered the summer of 1918, when fresh American divisions had poured into France like a flood that drowned German hopes. He remembered the faces of soldiers who had held the line for 4 years only to watch it crumble in months. He remembered surrender. The men around him did not remember. They were too young, or too foolish, or too afraid to speak. As Canaris approached the Reichstag chamber, he passed a young colonel with an eye patch and a missing hand. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. Claus von Stauffenberg. A decorated hero. A rising star. A man whose eyes held something dangerous. Recognition passed between them like electricity between storm clouds. Neither spoke. Neither nodded. In the Third Reich, trust was suicide and silence was survival. But Canaris filed the moment away in the vast archive of his memory. Someday, men like Stauffenberg might prove useful. Or necessary. The Reichstag chamber blazed with lights and cameras. Hitler had transformed what remained of German democracy into a stage for his performances. The representatives sat in perfect rows, their arms raised in salute, their voices ready to cheer on command. Canaris took his position among the military leadership and arranged his face into an expression of loyal attention. Hitler entered to thunderous applause. He wore his simple military tunic, the Iron Cross from the last war pinned above his heart. His voice started low, almost reasonable, recounting the provocations America had committed. The weapons shipped to England. The warships protecting convoys. The insults hurled by Roosevelt. Each grievance built upon the last until his voice rose to the shriek that crowds found intoxicating and Canaris found nauseating. Germany has never sought this war with America, Hitler declared. But Germany will not shrink from any enemy. We fight for the future of our race, for the soil that feeds our children, for the destiny that history has chosen us to fulfill. The chamber erupted. Arms shot upward. Voices roared approval. Canaris raised his arm with the others, his face betraying nothing, but his mind wandered to a different calculation. American shipyards had launched more tonnage in 1941 than Germany had launched since 1933. American aircraft factories were producing planes faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. American training camps were turning millions of civilians into soldiers. Hitler spoke of willpower conquering material. Canaris thought of the Western Front in 1918, where German willpower had met American material and lost. The speech ended. The representatives voted unanimously for war, as if voting mattered, as if any of them would dare dissent. Canaris filed out with the other officers, accepting congratulations he did not want, smiling at jokes he did not find funny. That night, alone in his office, he drafted a secret assessment for eyes that might never read it. He wrote of factories and oil fields, of shipping lanes and production quotas. He wrote of time running out, then he burned the document and watched the truth turn to ash. Some knowledge was too dangerous to survive in the Third Reich. But Canaris would remember. And when the time came, he would act. The gallows were patient. They could wait. Private Hans Mahler could no longer feel his feet. This was not a complaint but a fact, as solid and undeniable as the frozen earth beneath him. 3 days ago, he had removed his boots to check for frostbite and found his toes the color of old candle wax. He had not removed his boots since. What he could not see could not terrify him. The Russian village burned 200 meters to the east. German soldiers clustered around the flames like moths, not celebrating conquest but simply trying to survive another night. The temperature had fallen to -30 degrees. At this cold, spit froze before it hit the ground. Rifle mechanisms jammed solid. Tank engines refused to start unless fires burned beneath them for hours. Men who sat down to rest sometimes never stood again. Hans pressed his pencil stub against a scrap of paper, writing to his wife by the light of burning Russian homes. His ink had frozen solid 3 weeks ago, so pencil would have to serve. The words came slowly, each one a small act of defiance against the war that wanted to erase him. Liebling, he wrote. They announced today that America has joined England. The officers say this changes nothing. They say our submarines will starve the Americans before they can cross the ocean. They say victory is certain. Hans paused. Around him, the remnants of his company huddled in whatever shelter they could find. Of the 180 men who had marched toward Moscow in October, fewer than 90 remained. The rest lay frozen in fields they had never learned the names of, buried in snow that would not melt until spring revealed their bodies to the crows. But I saw Captain Werner's face when he read the announcement, Hans continued. He looked like a man who has just learned the date of his own funeral. He tried to hide it, but I have learned to read faces in this war. Faces tell the truth that mouths cannot speak. A sergeant approached through the darkness, his breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. Fresh orders from Berlin. The offensive would continue. The Führer had forbidden any retreat, any consolidation, any acknowledgement that winter and distance had defeated German planning. Every meter of Russian soil was to be held. Every position was to be defended to the last man and the last bullet. Hans wondered if the men who wrote such orders had ever felt cold like this. He wondered if they had ever watched friends die from weather rather than combat. He wondered if they understood that willpower could not defeat physics, that courage could not warm frozen blood, that metals could not resurrect the dead. Moscow is 20 kilometers away, he wrote. I can see its glow on the horizon when the sky is clear. 20 kilometers. In France, we cover 20 kilometers before breakfast. Here, 20 kilometers might as well be 20,000. The Russians fight for every village, every road, every frozen field. They burn what they cannot hold. They vanish into forests we cannot follow. They know this land. This cold. This war of patience. A convoy of wounded men passed along the road behind him, heading west toward aid stations that might or might not still exist. Hans watched their faces in the firelight. Empty eyes stared at nothing. Bandaged stumps marked where frostbite had claimed fingers and toes. Some men simply sat in the transport vehicles and wept, their tears freezing on their cheeks like tiny monuments to suffering. Hans thought of his daughter, Greta, who had just turned 4 when he left for the front. She would be 5 now. He tried to picture her face and found the image fading, replaced by other faces. Dead Russians in frozen ditches. German boys who had laughed at his jokes and now would never laugh again. A Soviet soldier he had shot at close range, their eyes meeting for an instant before life left them. If I do not return, Hans wrote, the pencil trembling in fingers he could barely feel, tell Greta that her father believed in something once. Tell her that I marched east because I thought I was protecting her from enemies that threatened our home. Tell her that belief can be a kind of blindness, and that I pray she learns to see more clearly than I did. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his tunic, close to his chest where his body heat might keep the paper from freezing brittle. He did not know if it would ever reach Germany. The postal service from the front had become as unreliable as the supply lines, as unpredictable as survival itself. Moscow glowed on the horizon. 20 kilometers away. An eternity of ice and blood. Hans closed his eyes and dreamed of summer. Of his wife's laughter. Of his daughter's small hand in his. When he woke, the fires had died and the cold had grown teeth. Another day on the Eastern Front had begun. The wheelchair moved silently across the carpet of the Oval Office, carrying the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere toward a wall covered in charts and projections. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had not slept well since December 7. The weight of 2,000 American dead pressed against his chest each morning when he woke. But weight had never stopped him before. Polio had taken his legs. The Depression had tested his will. Now Hitler had given him purpose. General George Marshall stood at attention beside the charts, his uniform crisp, his posture perfect, his mind already calculating numbers that would determine the fate of millions. He had served in France during the last war, had seen American industrial power crush German ambition in 18 months. He knew what factories could do. He knew what time could buy. How long? Roosevelt asked. The question needed no context. Both men understood. Marshall did not hesitate. He had rehearsed this answer in his mind for months, running the calculations again and again until they became as natural as breathing. 2 years to build the force, Mr. President. 6 months to train them properly. Another 6 months to transport them across the Atlantic in sufficient numbers to matter. We cannot seriously threaten German-held Europe until spring of 1944 at the earliest. The number hung in the room like smoke. 1944, 3 years away. 3 years of German occupation. 3 years of U-boat attacks. 3 years of concentration camps that American intelligence had begun to whisper about but could not yet confirm. Roosevelt wheeled himself closer to the production charts. His eyes, sharp despite his exhaustion, traced the curves of projected output. Steel. Aluminum. Rubber. Oil. The raw materials of modern warfare. The lifeblood of victory. Tell me about the factories, he said. Marshall's pointer moved across the chart. The automobile plants in Detroit are already converting. By February, they will produce tanks instead of cars. The shipyards in Newport News, Philadelphia, and San Francisco are operating around the clock. We launched more vessels last month than Germany has launched all year. He flipped to another chart. Aircraft production will triple by summer. Boeing is expanding. Lockheed is expanding. Consolidated is building a facility in Texas that will become the largest factory in the world. By 1943, we will produce more planes in a single month than the Luftwaffe has produced since the war began. Roosevelt nodded slowly. The numbers confirmed what he had always believed. America's true strength was not its army, which remained small and poorly equipped. It was not its navy, which had just suffered its worst defeat in history. America's strength was its capacity to build. To manufacture. To transform peacetime prosperity into wartime production on a scale that no nation had ever attempted. Hitler believes he has 12 months to win this war, Roosevelt said. He thinks that if Germany can defeat Russia and fortify Europe before we arrive, the war will become too costly for us to continue. Marshall allowed himself a small smile. Then Hitler does not understand American factories, Mr. President. Or American resolve. He gestured to a final chart, one that showed projected deployment schedules stretching into 1944 and beyond. Operation Bolero will begin transferring troops to England within 6 months. By 1943, we will have enough men and material staged in Britain to consider offensive operations. By 1944, we will invade. Roosevelt studied the chart. Somewhere on its neat lines and careful projections lay the fates of millions. American boys who would cross an ocean to fight. German soldiers who would meet them on beaches and fields. Civilians caught between armies that cared nothing for their lives. The mathematics of war reduced human beings to numbers, but Roosevelt never forgot that each number had a face, a family, a future that war would steal. Hitler has made his final mistake, Marshall continued. He has unified America in a way that nothing else could. Pearl Harbor killed 2,000 of our men. Germany's declaration of war has raised an army of millions. Through the windows of the Oval Office, Washington spread out beneath a winter sky. Government buildings hummed with activity. Telephone lines carried orders to factories across the nation. Young men stood in lines outside recruiting stations, eager to avenge what Japan had begun and Germany had embraced. The clock had started running. Not the 12 months Hitler imagined, but a longer count. A patient count. The count of American industry converting, American soldiers training, American ships launching. Berlin did not know it yet. The wolf's lair could not hear it. The frozen soldiers outside Moscow could not feel it, but the clock was running, and it would not stop until the war was won.